you? The computer nodes can be repaired. Who are you?
Oh, that's quite simple. I hate computers and refuse to be bullied by them.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the MS-DOS project. Today I will be talking about a game that came out just over a year and a half ago, the System Shock Remake. 2023 saw the release or announcement of many widely anticipated remakes or remasters for beloved games, such as Resident Evil 4 and Super Mario RPG. None sits closer to my heart and was more awaited by me than the remake of the original System Shock. I reviewed the Enhanced Edition a few years back on this channel, and you can watch it right here if you'd like. After playing the original two games, I anxiously awaited this remake, which had kind of a bumpy history. I'll give you a synopsis of why this one took over 6 years to get to market and how it evolved over its entire development. If you enjoy playing PC games from the mid to late 90s or early 2000s, you've probably heard of Nightdive Studios. They've made a name for themselves in getting the rights to these games and updating them to work on modern hardware. Their history is particularly tied to the System Shock franchise. It all started with a desire to easily play some classic computer games on a long-distance road trip. In 2012, Stephen Kick and his wife Alex had both been character artists at Sony Online Entertainment for several years. Both decided they'd had enough of the corporate world and decided to quit their jobs at Sony, and subsequently began a months-long road trip from San Diego down to South America in 2012. To pass the time, Stephen brought a netbook and several classic video games on CD to play. This is when laptops still came with CD drives, unlike nowadays. One of these games was System Shock 2. Kick recalls the story as follows, quote, "By the time we reached Guatemala, we were staying in this jungle hostel, like down in the deepest parts of the jungle," Kick says. "And one night there was this power outage, this amazing storm. These lightning bolts were hitting the village nearby. It was really terrifying. So, of course, the first thing I did was booted up the little laptop and attempted to play System Shock 2. The problem, however, is that the game refused to run. Over the years, Windows has slowly dropped support for disk verification software and other DRM techniques that were used as copy protection, meaning that many of these old games will simply refuse to launch without some sort of modification. Kick searched online for a fan patch and even looked on GOG.com for an updated patched version for sale, but found it was no longer available anywhere. There was simply no way to run the game on modern hardware at that point, even though he owned a legitimate copy. After finding this out, he browsed around a bit and found an article that told him that the rights to the System Shock franchise were currently held by the Meadowbrook Insurance Company, who had gained the intellectual property rights to the series in the wake of Looking Glass going under. Quote, "From there I just started sending out emails without any kind of clear plan or path on what it was I was looking for or what I was going to do," close quote. The company responded after a few days and asked what Kick wanted to do with the IP, and he simply pitched updating the game and re-releasing it on GOG.com, as it was highly requested by users of the site, with over 34,000 of them saying they wanted to buy it. This appealed to the insurance company, as they didn't really want to develop a new entry in the series, and so Stephen Kick and his wife immediately turned around at the Panama Canal and headed back to the States so they could work on this new project. Eventually, the project of updating the game for modern users led to the formation of a small company called Nightdive Studios. Once they finally got System Shock 2 relisted and available for sale online, they realized there was a lot of success to be had on this little niche of updating old games to run on modern hardware. One of the first projects they took on after releasing System Shock 2 was working on going even further back and updating the original System Shock for modern audiences. The original game still had a lot to offer and enjoy, but the control scheme was painful to navigate in 1994, not to mention 2014. So Nightdive began their work there, working alongside a member of the SystemShock.org forums to implement a mouse look mod, which helped to make movement much more intuitive to control, as well as being much more accessible for first-time players. This forum member was brought on for further improvements, and this is when an unexpected stroke of luck hit. While working on the Enhanced Edition of System Shock, the Nightdive team had reached out to two of the original creators, Warren Spector and Paul Norath, to see if they had any help or insights that they could provide. It turned out that they had just rediscovered the source code for the Mac version not long before Nightdive reached out, and they were more than happy to share it with the team. With the source code, the team was able to turn the project into a full-on source port, with widescreen and high-resolution support, fully remappable controls, mod support, and much more. However, in developing this and just playing around in the game world to test it, the team had a lot of fun just exploring Citadel Station, and realized it was a prime candidate for a proper remake. Thus, 2 months after releasing System Shock Enhanced Edition, Nightdive Studios announced their intentions to fully remake the game. They took to Kickstarter in June of 2016 to source funds for their project. It was unclear at the start the exact nature of this project, but early announcements saw a shift from calling it a faithful remaster to a remake, which was probably a much more apt designation. At this point, Chris Avellone and other members of the Fallout New Vegas teams were listed as being on the project, though it seems their contributions were never used in the final project. This Kickstarter raised over $1.3 million, and a December 2017 release date was announced. As you probably know, however, the project would end up delayed far beyond this original release target. At this point in development, the remake was being developed in Unity, with a short playable demo released to show what this version would be like. As you can see on the screen, the demo simply lets you play through a very small portion of the medical level, almost exactly as it was in the original. It appears much darker and gloomier here than even in the final version of the game, and we really don't get that much of an idea of how different this version would have been from what we eventually got. It is, however, a cool little snapshot of the game very early on, with a radically different inventory and menu system than the one that ended up in the final product, though that's probably for the best. About a year later, at the 2017 Game Developers Conference, Nightdive announced they'd be shifting development of the project over to Unreal Engine, citing issues with performance, fidelity, and the ability to easily port it to consoles as the reasons for the switch. It was also stated that they would be modifying the project from a remake to a, quote, faithful reboot, essentially keeping a lot of things the same, such as the general levels, enemy, and plot, but allowing for changes to the level design and other gameplay features. It's unclear completely what this version looked like, as we did not get any demos or much information at all during this stage of development, but the director Jason Fader said that they were looking to remove many of the needless mazes from the original to simplify it for modern audiences. There is, however, a ton of concept art that has been released from this reboot stage of development. Some of this involves alternate enemies, weapons, locations, and more. I could honestly do a whole video based on cut content in the cancelled version of this game, as the reboot idea spawned a ton of content that was totally unlike the original but fascinating in its own right. It's interesting to think about what the game would have looked like if this direction remained until release, but as it turns out, it didn't make it very far at all at this stage. After another year passed with very few updates, Stephen Kick announced in February of 2018 that the project was taking a short hiatus to reassess and reevaluate. Apparently, development was suffering from major feature creep, and thus was restarted almost from scratch as a remake to refocus on the promises they'd made back in 2016. A 2020 launch target was announced, and even though this wasn't to be, it did mark real progress being made for the first time on the game, as it would eventually be released. As the team was essentially going to remake the game in as faithful a manner as possible from this point on, they started by blocking out each of the levels to closely match how they were designed in the original. Being able to use the source code and level designs directly from the Enhanced Edition made this process much smoother and faster than would have otherwise been possible if they only had the final game data to reference. Once level blocking was finished, the developers then applied the original texture data to the newly modeled levels to use as a starting point to reimagine and recreate what existed in the original game. This was released to Kickstarter backers as the, quote, Adventure Alpha, and was the real starting point of the game as it is now. From there, they started recreating, reimagining, and rebuilding each level and asset, trying to fill it out more to fit modern standards. Rob Waters, who led art direction on the original game, was instrumental in helping the team accomplish this goal. As Stephen Kick said in an interview with Ars Technica, quote, "It really started with Rob Waters. We basically tasked him with taking the last 25 years of industry experience he had gained to reimagine all these things he did from what was essentially his very first project. And with that, we've got something that's very uniquely System Shock that nobody else can do. That's really the strongest foundation for our art style. But it was a conscious effort by our developers to really call back to those original textures in there, like text density and such. We'll have that present while still also having a modern, fully detailed look. It should look absolutely amazing from the normal vantage point of view, but once you get really close up to it, more or less pays homage to the original by breaking down into that chunky pixel look," close quote. In many cases, they wanted to fill in areas that were not very detailed in the original game, adding corpses, desks, and other details to areas to make them feel more alive and true to their original function. As Kick went on to say, quote, "Every level has a unique tile set that's loosely based off of the original, but then greatly expands on that. What kind of tools are around, the kind of debris left there, even the uniforms of the corpses change based on the level, the function of that area," close quote. We will see how this reflects in the actual game in a little bit, but suffice it to say that a lot of work was done to stay true to the original, while retooling some sections to be a bit more memorable or fit better with the overall theme of the level. The next demo released in May of 2020, this time showing off the entirety of the medical level. Not everything was finished, however, as the voice lines still had to be re-recorded from the original game and the cyberspace sections needed to be finished, but this gave a really good idea of how the final product would look. and it seemed they had finally overcome their obstacles with a 2021 release date planned. A lot of people were skeptical as it had already been delayed several times, and they were right. The game took another several years after that to come out, finally releasing on May 31st of 2023. So, was this game worth all the delays and setbacks? Or is it as much of a broken mess as most other games that end up being released these days? I will share my 2 cents about that, but the critics by and large seem to have been impressed, with PC Gamer calling it, quote, the definitive way to play System Shock in 2023 and beyond, close quote. Although many reviewers may have wished that Nightdive had opted to change some of the more outdated mechanics of the game, as they say, it still received tons of praise from the media. Normally at this point in a review, I would talk about the physical product. There is a nice big box edition that Kickstarter backers above a certain tier received, but as the large majority of people will be playing this game digitally, and I didn't back the project, I won't be covering that. One thing I will be talking about is the excellent newly produced manual that was created for this remake. This manual used to be available digitally on Steam wherever the game was installed, but with recent updates it appears to have disappeared from the game files. It is still available for download from the GOG Extras section, or it can also be found online in a few places if you know where to look. The original manual for System Shock, titled Terminal Access, was largely filled with instructions on controls in the interface, which makes sense as this kind of game was brand new and the control scheme was fairly convoluted due to the absence of mouse look. The remake, however, benefits from 3 decades of consumer experience with first-person shooters, and so instead a lot of the manual is flavored more like an old-school Ultima manual. There are many pages detailing how society is under the rule of the Trioptimum Corporation, including social classes, jobs, and more. They even include a self-administered personality test to determine what career you should follow in this universe. One of my favorite sections of the manual is all about Shodan, detailing how she was ethically constrained, how she makes decisions, and even a psych evaluation given to her to determine her intelligence and creativity. It's this sort of detail that makes a manual completely worth it, and that I miss in most modern games, and I believe it helps to bridge the gap between the real world and the game world just a little bit. There are of course sections dedicated to things like the user interface, enemies, weapons, and tools, all presented in a way that makes sense as a sort of guide to Citadel Station before Shodan took over everything. So in addition to being a fun source of lore, it's also a functional manual that can help you to understand everything you find without much of a tutorial. I do also appreciate that they credit the original developers here in the manual, which is a super classy move to remember all the work they put into the original. Once you boot up the game, you'll be greeted by a photosensitivity warning and a little animated Nightdive ident. You will then land on this title screen, which shows a nice external view of Citadel Station in orbit around Saturn. You are presented with all the normal menu options like loading a save file, starting a new game, exiting back to the desktop, and of course the options menu. The options menu is broken down into 5 submenus. The first is titled Gameplay, which allows you to enable or disable certain things like minimap rotation, auto reloads, and tutorials. The next section, Controls, has all the useful bells and whistles for controlling look inversion, sensitivity, etc., as well as full reminding for both keyboards and mouse and controller. Display, graphics, and audio are all as you would expect in a modern title, with options to use things like DLSS, change the FOV, and manually tune graphical fidelity for performance. You also have several individual volume sliders, which is nice. And lastly, the accessibility menu allows you to pick languages, adjust the HUD elements, and turn on subtitles. Upon starting a new game, you are given a fine-tuned, multifaceted difficulty selection menu, which is something that was pulled almost wholesale from the original game. Here, each section of difficulty in the original game is on a scale from 1 to 3, with 1 being the easiest and 3 being the hardest. In the original version, however, there was also a level 0 for each difficulty setting, which basically turned the game into almost a museum instead of a challenge.
Yeah, it's just, maybe we can find something more suited to my level.
And what level is that?
Well, I'm not a master, but, let's just start at 0, level 0.
Oh, no, there is no such thing as level 0.
As in the original game, you can adjust the difficulty of the story, the combat, the cyberspace sections, and the puzzles, respectively. The menu has a fun little graphic on the right-hand side that adjusts to indicate the difficulty level in each of these aspects, which is sort of a cool visual representation of what to expect when you play. When a difficulty level is selected, it will describe to you what to expect, in a similar vein to how the original System Shock did. One thing to note is if you pick the hardest difficulty for story, you will be given a time limit in which to finish the game. Here it has been bumped up to 10 hours from the 7 that the original version gave you, but I would still recommend beating the game at least once on normal difficulties to get a feel for locations and quests before jumping into all 3s. My first playthrough probably took about 13-14 hours, so you'll want at least one run through before attempting it with a time limit. However, once you're familiar, the time limit's not awful. As my high difficulty run, I finished the game with about an hour to spare. One option that's been added to the game via post-launch updates is the ability to choose your character's gender. At launch you were stuck with being a male hacker, but now you can choose to be a female if you'd like. As far as I can tell, gender is entirely cosmetic, with the female hacker getting fingernail paint and feminine sound effects for taking damage, as well as some other changes to the model for the few times you see it in third person. There are, however, a few things such as the death sound that seem to be exactly the same between the male and female version, and I'm not sure if that's intentional or if that's something that might be fixed with further updates. Once you are happy with your options and start a new game, a reimagined version of the intro cutscene from the 1994 edition of the game will begin. The original cutscene took place entirely from a third-person perspective, and mostly told you what was going on in the scenes you were being shown. Here, however, everything is from a first-person perspective. Initially, this is from the point of view of a drone that is flying through the cityscape of New Atlanta, before spotting you, a hacker. At this point, the perspective switches to your player character, and you can move about the apartment for a bit, including entering the bathroom. After a minute or so, you will come to your computer in order to begin your hack of the Tri-Optimum Corporation to steal information on Neural Interface. Of course, Tri-Op is already onto you, and their corporate police come in and take you away. You wake up at the desk of one Edward Diego, an executive for Tri-Optimum and commander of Citadel Station, which you have been brought aboard as a prisoner for your crimes. Seems pretty crazy to be deported all the way from the Earth, halfway across the solar system to Saturn, just because you tried to hack their systems, but I guess that's how Tri-Optimum deals with things. Instead of punishment, however, Diego offers you an under-the-table deal. Remove the ethical constraints for him from the station's AI, and he will not only drop the charges, but give you the implant you wanted to steal and the surgery to put it in your head. Again, this is experienced mostly from a first-person perspective, and you do as he asks considering you don't really have much of a choice. Of course, he then knocks you out again, and you won't wake up until you've recovered from the surgery. One interesting thing to note is that the original intro specifies that the recovery time for this surgery is 6 months, meaning that Shodan, the AI you just gave free rein to the station, has 6 months to do her damage before you wake up. In the remake, this isn't explicitly stated, but you can see that about 6 months have passed based off the date given in the intro and the dates given in audio logs and emails throughout the game. Upon completion of the intro, you wake up from your healing coma and slide off of bed inside a recovery suite. And just as in the original, there is no tutorial, no real instructions, just you and a whole space station in front of you. Now that's not to say there's no help at all. Every time you pick up a new weapon or piece of hardware, the game will pop up a mini set of instructions on what it does and how to use it. Almost like the little corner pop-ups in Half-Life 2 that tell you the controls from time to time.
Let me read a letter I recently received. Dear Dr. Bree, why has the seemed free to say how reproductive side? Sincerely.
The opening area immediately brings to mind the original version for me. Textures, objects, and enemies are instantly recognizable, and every interaction from the original has been brought straight into the 21st century. For example, when you grab a cybernetic module, your character will pick it up and inspect it before inserting it into your head. Another of my favorite examples of bringing this 1994 world alive is with the healing beds, where you now physically enter and have a healing animation instead of just clicking and being healed right away. Making these objects all have a bit more interaction, animation, and life makes this immersive sim just that bit more immersive for me. One of the biggest barriers that kept people from trying the original System Shock, even with the Enhanced Edition, was the extremely dated control scheme and user interface. Luckily, that seems to have been a focus for Nightdive in making this remake, as it is a large upgrade over the original. The user interface in particular is more minimal while still having a few shades of the original. The top right corner shows your health and electrical charge, in a similar style to how it used to be. The top section eventually shows a compass when you pick up the appropriate hardware module, and while it doesn't give you a quest marker to show you exactly where you need to go unless you play on the easiest difficulty, it does make it a bit easier to know which direction you are facing without opening the minimap. The top left section is fairly abstract with a bunch of lines that don't immediately mean anything. The manual says that it shows stamina, energy, and stimulant effects on your body, and these lines do change all the time, but if you ignore it mostly, you won't really be missing a lot. Right below this HUD element, messages will pop up from time to time telling you about your status or the status of the station. The bottom left section of the screen shows the minimap. Like in the original game, the map is not filled in with the start. with each floor starting out completely empty and blank, and only fills in the rooms as you explore. It is upgraded over the original, however, as the map will fill with important landmarks such as elevators, charging stations, and more. An optional upgrade that can be picked up later on for the mapping unit will even mark out areas of the map that are flooded with dangerous radiation or biological contamination. The minimap can also be set up to either always be oriented with north up, or be pointed in whatever direction you're facing at the time, which is a nice option to have. If you pull up the full map, it also has the option to add custom named map markers akin to how Ultima Underworld did it, which is especially nice if you need to drop a gun for some reason and want to find it again later. The very bottom of the screen contains the hotbar, whereas in the original version, basically the entire inventory sat on the bottom of the screen. Now you choose 10 items to switch between with a single key or button press. For a lot of my playthrough, I was kind of annoyed with it because the default hotbar setting is sorted, which gives a certain amount of slots dedicated to weapons, grenades, and patches respectively. By late game, you will have amassed quite a few weapons, and the 4 standard slots it gives isn't quite enough to put all the ones you have on your hotbar. Of course, I only discovered recently that there's a standard setting that gives you full control of all 10 hotbar slots. At any time, you can hit tab to open up the inventory screen. Here, Nightdive opted to go away from the inventory system they originally used, which simply limited you to a certain number of items of each type, and instead switched to a grid-based system. This type of inventory management was used in System Shock 2 and many other games, and at times it will require you to shuffle things around or even drop them so you can physically take a new gun or other important item with you. On the bottom beneath the inventory screen is a variety of tabs you can click on for more information. Here you can access maps of every floor on the station, information about the station, any of your emails or audio logs, and a list of all your currently installed hardware modules and what version you have. Not all of these menus are as immediately useful as the map, but they all do a good job at quickly showing you the information you need at any given point in the game. One of my favorite parts of this remake is the unique art style and direction. Most games set in space where you have to survive an infested station are really dark and moody, including the sequel System Shock 2. However, the original System Shock opted for a mostly bright atmosphere to reflect the original use and intent of the spaces of the station, to be shown as it was when it was fully operational and inhabited, just with critters and robot infesting these same spaces. And this style was definitely replicated by the remake. Each floor and even small spaces within that floor have real function. From gardens to research labs, offices, and even theaters, everywhere on board looks like a real space with a real human use. And each individual area matches the design and style that was given to it in the original, just with more pixels, polygons, and better lighting. The art style itself, however, is not super gritty and realistic. A glance at a scene will look fairly high fidelity, but when you get up close to an enemy or a texture, you will see that they are slightly pixelated. This not only serves as a good nod to the original 1994 game, but it's a fairly original art style that separates it from the dead spaces of the world. The distinctive bright art style also makes it easy to distinguish what floor you are on at any time without even checking the map. For example, the research labs have a strong red color throughout, while storage has lots of green all over the walls. While this choice may have originally been due to the limitations of 1994 PCs, the choice to bring these colors and designs over to the remake helps to bring tons of visual variety to the game, and it makes you wonder what you're going to see next when you head up that elevator again. In many cases, objects have been faithfully translated from the original game to the remake, especially in the case of common objects like charging stations, cyberspace jacks, and the many enemies that now inhabit Citadel Station. It makes the game feel like you imagined it in your head in 1994, which in my mind is exactly what a remake should seek to do. In a few cases, however, items and objects carried over from the original were tweaked or changed to look completely different. One obvious example of this is the security cameras, which in the original looked a bit more like Chunky's 90s security cameras. Another one that stands out a bit is the dermal patches, which are a completely different shape and style from the original game, but still gels very well with the overall aesthetic. And I'm glad they didn't feel the need to switch these over to hypos to match System Shock 2. In every case I can recall, however, these changes were positive and made for better visual clarity as well as better stylistic cohesion. The patches in particular are a huge upgrade, as the symbols on them are much more distinctive and easy to distinguish on the floor or in the heat of battle than these small color changes between patches that were present in the original game. Even though I've played this game a few times before, both via the original and the remake, the thing I noticed on this playthrough is how differently the game is structured than most first-person shooters. Traditional FPS games prior to System Shock were typically structured with distinct missions that would begin and end with a loading screen. Even shooters like Half-Life that are more seamless have a distinct level or mission structure that's a sort of linear progression. System Shock, however, plays more like a Metroidvania type game, where there's a vast map that is not all accessible at the start and requires a lot of backtracking. For example, when you get to the maintenance level, there are many corridors that are completely locked down. You are told that they are shut down because no maintenance is required at that moment. Later in the story, you will want to eject one of the grove habitats to expel a virus that Shodam has created. But a mechanical fault is defected and the corridors will all open. And beyond just the access to extra sections of the level, you will be able to access new gear because of it. There are tons of examples of this throughout the game, and it makes it all feel much more real and interconnected to me. System Shock was always somewhat unique as a first-person shooter, and this type of level and progression structure makes it even more so. One thing this game certainly is not is a role-playing game or even close to one. Although you do collect equipment that can be upgraded over time, you don't ever get any sort of experience points or skills to upgrade, unlike in the sequel. I am glad that the team stayed faithful to the original progression system of the game, but also added a bit of a new twist to it. There are a few additions to the game over the original version that I believe enhance the experience slightly over the original. One of the most notable of these is the addition of a scrapping and recycling system. In the original game, there were tons of useless scrap items that, while they increased immersion, served no real value to the player. However, in the remake, every item can be recycled directly to get some credits, or it can be turned into scrap which can later be exchanged for these credits. This is done at recycling stations available on most floors and serves to make every item at least worth considering picking up. This does complicate inventory management a bit, as it's no longer just weapons, aid patches, and quest items you need to carry around, but you could potentially also be filling your inventory up with tons of tri-optimum junk. It does, however, balance out the system in my mind, as everything you pick up will mean one less spot for a grenade or ammo. The credits you either pick up in the world or get from recycling are useful in a wide variety of ways. They can be spent in an assortment of vending machines in order to get patches, food, or ammo. But most importantly, they can be used for one of the most important new systems in the game, weapon modding. In the original version of System Shock, if you picked up a weapon, it was always going to be as you found it, and you could only improve your combat abilities by replacing old weapons with better ones of the same variety. For the remake, however, Nightdive elected to cut down on the number of different unique weapons available, and instead focused on making each one unique as well as upgradable. Throughout Citadel, there are mod stations where you can spend your credits on modifications for your various weapons. These mods can do anything from increasing ammo capacity to enabling full auto-fire or decreasing cooldown times on energy weapons. In every case, these mod kits increase your ability to do sustained damage to enemies, and you will want to gather as many credits as possible to be able to use these modifications when you find them. I think that this focus on making every weapon have a unique niche and not just having 8 different types of grenade and 4 varieties of each weapon type was a massive improvement to the game. Although I do occasionally miss something like the dart pistol or the Earthshaker explosive, the tightened weapons sandbox works in the game's favor and keeps the action moving as much as possible. It also becomes much more exciting to pick up a new weapon, and you will immediately notice the impact of grabbing the assault rifle.
Now I have a machine gun. Ho, ho, ho.
Although this upgrade system was not part of the game as conceived in 1994, I think it fits right in with all the existing systems. It forces you to explore every corner of every floor if you want to be at full power, and it gives every mug, plate, and piece of scrap metal a use in progressing your mission. And I think it feeds right back into that combat system. One thing that differentiated the original System Shock from its sequel was the heavier focus on straight combat. Yes, there were some horror elements and some strategy to combat, but it was less of sneaking down corridors with a barely functioning gun and more just blasting enemies as soon as you could. In the remake, they definitely toned up the horror a bit, but the combat is still absolutely the main focus. No RPG-like upgrades, no weapon durability, just focusing on having enough firepower to take down every cyborg freak that stands in your way. The way combat flows in this game is perhaps more akin to a title like the original Half-Life than something like Doom or Quake. You can go into encounters with guns blazing and not have to worry about a gun jamming or anything, however you are still just a hacker and not a super soldier. Oftentimes you'll need to poke your head around a corner to survey what enemies are there from a distance and determine what tools and weapons are needed to clear the area. For example, you'll happen upon a room like this filled with robots. Some of them are active and patrolling while some are dormant, seemingly charging on the walls. Charging in and just shooting the patrolling bots first will wake up the rest of the ones in the room, likely resulting in your death. So you have a lot of options here. Do you place a bunch of mines to take out some and then pick the rest off from a distance? Do you enable your force fields, use a berserk pass, and slash them all to death with your laser rapier? Or do you use the entrance door and lift to bottleneck them and make shooting them that much easier? Each of these are equally valid choices, which is part of what makes the combat in this game so satisfying. Because of the difficulty of the combat even on easier modes, you will likely find yourself dying a bunch. You can save and load at any time, which makes this more trivial. However, sometimes you may not want to do so. Almost every level has a device that is called a restoration bay that you will want to seek out and get working. As the manual states, quote, "Restoration bays are meant to be used in the event of an absolute emergency. Lost limbs or wounds that are too great for the surgery machine can be addressed in this device. Simply place the individual who requires care into the machine along with their missing appendages and let the machine do all the work." Close quote. The problem is that Shodan has messed with all of these machines to instead serve to turn people into cyborgs. So on each floor where one of these resides, you will have to track it down and flip a switch to make it work to your gain. Once standard restoration procedures have been restored for a floor, upon death you will find yourself awake in one of these bays with a portion of health restored. All of your progress will remain at this point, so if you get an enemy down to 1 bar of health left, you can run back to where they are and finish them off. Kind of reminiscent to me of the trek from a bonfire to a boss in Dark Souls, but instead here everything is retained, meaning death has far fewer consequences. On easier difficulty levels, you can get sent back to these restoration bays from across multiple floors if you die, but on the hardest combat levels, each machine on each floor must be activated in order to use them. Otherwise, you will see this creepy death screen, which has been faithfully updated from the original version.
Do you believe there is a soul, hacker?
Let us find out together.
A pretty harrowing fate for our hacker. Luckily, you can quick save almost anywhere, so if you die, you don't have to lose hours of progress. The restoration bays are still nice to have, even if just to escape a difficult combat situation and avoid a soft lock. Combat that makes you think is a great selling point on its own, but it falls apart if the controls suck, which is often the case in the original System Shock. It's not really that version's fault as it was one of the first games of its kind, but it definitely served as a barrier to entry for many years. So of course, as mentioned earlier, that was a major focus in developing this game. And I think they nailed it, at least for the mouse and keyboard controls. The original game had a lot of options on how to position your character, including leans, crouching, going prone, etc. And while this version cut out the prone position in any sections that needed it, the lean is still there and is easily accessible by hitting the Q and E keys. And you will want to use it as it allows you to peek around corners and take shots at enemies that may kill you in just a few hits if you fully expose yourself to their fire. Another key control aspect that was updated was the ability to change fire modes or ammo types for weapons. System Shock had the novel ability to be able to choose between different ammunition types for ballistic weapons, such as armor-piercing or hollow-tip rounds, as well as changing the amount of energy that laser weapons would use per shot. Each of these was vital for fighting different classes of enemies and conserving resources, but it was often a clunky affair with having to go down to the menu to either unload one kind of ammo and load in a new one, or change the amount of charge on an energy weapon. Instead, here it's all managed by hitting the T key, which will instantly swap to another type of ammo if available, or modify the energy level depending on the gun. This is all telegraphed nicely to the player, by either changing colors on the ammo readout, or with some sort of physical change to the weapon that will instantly let you know what your shot will look like when you fire. All of this serves to simplify the combat experience, which in turn makes stressful combat situations a little less so due to an abundance of information. One feature that I noticed way too late into my playtime was the ability to aim down sights. It's bound to a really weird key, because you have to press the middle mouse button to do it, and all it really seems to do is stabilize your aim a little bit and maybe zoom in on the weapon model. I don't really think it's that useful, and I didn't really miss it very much. And although it kind of sucks that it was only sort of half implemented, I really don't mind, as it doesn't seem to be detrimental to the gameplay at all. As for how the game plays with the controller, it's hit or miss. I only played around with it for about an hour, so I definitely don't have a ton of experience with it, but it seems to be okay. It does seem pretty clear to me that the remake was designed with keyboards in mind first. There are just way too many different inputs to make it super practical on an Xbox or PlayStation controller. And a lot of players that have played through the console versions seem to have complained about this online. For example, both lean and sprint are bound to clicking in the left stick, while only one piece of hardware, the system analyzer, is usable immediately with a button press. Additionally, when you switch to inventory mode, you end up having to move a mouse cursor around on the screen instead of quickly flipping between items with the stick. I am not sure how differently, if at all, this works on the console versions, but on PC it seems to be a mixed bag using a controller at best. Coming back to the combat, one class of weapons that seems to have elicited a mixed response online are the melee weapons. There are only 3 of them in the entire game: pipes, wrenches, and the ever awesome laser rapier. One thing I heard about the melee combat in this game is that it was floaty, but I didn't really see it. Sure, there isn't a ton of feedback or big swings with the melee weapons, but since your character is a hacker, I didn't really notice or mind much. And even games like Half-Life or Half-Life 2 never really had the most beefy melee weapons of all time. However, what makes these things super viable is a patch called the Berserk Combat Booster. When used, this patch will significantly increase your melee damage output, and with the laser rapier you can down some of the toughest enemies and bosses in this game in seconds. For as maligned as these melee weapons seem to have been, I actually find myself using them fairly frequently due to the Berserk patch, as well as to preserve ammo for tougher fights. You can also hold down the attack button for longer when using a melee weapon, allowing you to get off a more powerful swing. An important part of the combat and exploration puzzle are these patches. The Berserk patch I've already talked about, but a lot of other patches have interesting abilities too. The one you'll be using most frequently is the healing patch, which helps to recover a small amount of health over a little bit of time. However, there are patches that give other abilities that you will probably want to use from time to time. Some of these include basic abilities such as night vision or increased stamina, but one of my favorites allows you to slow down time, making some of these difficult combat encounters much easier by allowing you to react quicker to whatever's going on. Aside from player modification and dermal patches, another way that the player's abilities are enhanced throughout the game is through the discovery of hardware attachments. These can be fairly simple, like the data reader you pick up that allows you to use notes and emails, or it can be much more complicated and powerful, such as hover boots and force fields. These are all accessible through the inventory menus as buttons on either side of the screen, and also can be enabled or disabled via keyboard commands. It is important, however, to note that these attachments each draw at least a little bit of power, so it's not feasible to have them running all at once. In fact, you may consider turning off things like the compass or minimap in order to preserve battery for something more vital like your environmental suit or force fields. One of my favorite bits of kit that you can pick up is the target identifier. At first, all it does is identify what enemy you are looking at and say how much health it has, which, while useful, isn't super powerful on its own. However, as you continue to explore the station and find more advanced versions of the hardware, you will unlock abilities such as scrambling enemy systems and identifying weak spots. Although I wouldn't call this a role-playing game or even similar to one, the ability to upgrade these hardware attachments over time through exploration gives you a bit of a Metroidvania-esque sense of exploration that I talked about earlier. With your player character being a hacker, and the antagonist of the game being a power mad AI, it made sense that System Shock would include some form of hacking to progress. There have been many different ways that hacking has been represented in video games over the years, from quick and straightforward to difficult and even bad. Yes, I'm looking at you, Bethesda Fallout hacking. This thing sucks. Looking Glass, however, opted to make it its own separate game mode. In the 1994 version of System Shock, hacking consisted of a 6th degree of freedom shooter taking place in wireframe space. Sort of like Descent, but a year earlier, and nowhere near as good. These sections were necessary to unlock certain doors and find certain pieces of information, among other things. The idea was interesting, but in my opinion the execution was poor, largely due to the wireframe presentation making it hard to know where surfaces and tunnels between large areas were. This was also made worse by the weird control scheme that somehow is even more confusing than the FPS controls. Nightdive probably could have cut these sections out or made it a simple on-screen minigame, but they opted to remain somewhat faithful to the original intent and made the hacking game very similar to the original, with some important tweaks. First of all, the walls in this 6 degrees of freedom shooter are actually solid colors, which is a massive upgrade. Secondly, it's a lot more clear what you have to do. Barriers now have passed the buttons that open them, and enemies and objectives are much more clearly demarcated. However, just because they changed and improved the system doesn't necessarily mean it's good. My main problem with these sections is they seem to have overcompensated for the original version in some ways. While they may not be nearly as confusing to navigate, they now seem to be populated with many more enemies. And while it's fine to make them somewhat more challenging, sometimes the sheer number of enemies present at one time can make it almost inevitable that you'll die. Now, this is a tough game, and some deaths are expected, but when you die in cyberspace, you have to start over from the very beginning of that cyberspace section. you're completely unable to save during the cyberspace sections, and can only save before and after entering and exiting, meaning that I think these sections are really a lot more frustrating than they should be. This is even further worsened on the hardest difficulty, as dying in cyberspace also kills you in the real world. The real game world, that is. This isn't quite Inception levels of crazy. All of this can make later cyberspace levels extremely frustrating, as you can clear all the objectives, but then die to an enemy right before making your exit, as even if you're not playing on hard difficulty, you have to reach the exit for your progress to count. Overall, cyberspace is an improved, but still sometimes very frustrating experience, mostly having the effect of wanting me to get back to the regular first-person shooter action. Like almost all games released nowadays, this game has a set of achievements on all major platforms that it's been released on. A lot of people like to 100% a game, including getting all the achievements, and I'm happy to report that there's a lack of any that will truly cause you to pull your hair out. Many are plot related, some you almost certainly get by just playing the game, and some are just fun little ones related to a quirk or puzzle you can solve. For example, TV dinner unlocks if you shoot an overhead monitor, causing it to come crashing down and kill an enemy below. Or there's this one, that unlocks when you make an unfortunate purchase from a certain vending machine.
Enjoy your
The only achievement I found to be a little bit more on the difficult side were collectible ones. One of these involves backtracking to find every hidden scully that looks like Nightdive's logo across each level. And yet another requires you to find every single audio log and data stick on Citadel. While not being Korok Seed collection level of insanity, both of these will probably demand a guide and a significant combing over of every inch of every level. All in all, this remains a pretty easy game to get all the achievements in. So if this is a part of the experience that matters to you, then I think that System Shock checks all the boxes to be an enjoyable platinum. One of the most notable features of the original System Shock is the soundtrack. The game featured an energetic, upbeat soundtrack using lots of heavy beats and synths, composed by Tribe bassist Greg LaPiccolo. This soundtrack is not too dissimilar from games like Doom that were releasing at the same time, but each floor and even some individual areas had their own tracks. And while they opted to go with the new soundtrack for the remake, some of the motifs are still present in a few of them. Take a listen. There are also some other tracks which seem to be completely new, which are awesome as well. A feature that was groundbreaking in the original but has become more standard now is a dynamic soundtrack. Besides just having individual songs for individual levels, the song itself can change and become more intense and energetic depending on if you're in danger or at low health. And I think this feature is one of the things that made the original game great, and I'm glad it was retained here. One area of the sound that was massively upgraded was sound design for original monsters. The original game did have sound for each of the enemies, but it was pretty much just simple growls and robotic noises. Here, Nightdive rightfully took heavy inspiration from System Shock 2, which I think still has some of the best and creepiest sound design in a game to this day.
It's my job to worry. It won't I'll this weapon jammed.
And by doing so leaned into the horror aspects a bit more. All of this helps to ramp up the tension in horror just a bit, and while it may come off a bit tonally different than the original, I think it works really well and bridges the gap just a little bit more effectively with the sequel. Besides sometimes requiring different pieces of equipment in cyberspace to access, certain areas or doors can be locked behind faulty circuits that need to be repaired. This is the game's way of presenting small puzzles to you that you need to complete to progress. These come in two primary forms. The first type is a seemingly straightforward wire puzzle. You are given a set of plugs and wires and have to try to match them up as well as flipping some switches in such a way that the power is notched between these two teeny little blue notches. Sounds simple, but it can be a bit annoying to try to find the right combination to get the exact amount of power that you need. The other type of puzzle is also an electricity puzzle, but it handles electricity flow in a different way. Here, instead of wires, you have a set of pipes almost that you have to connect, sort of like the game Pipe Dreams. This one can be confusing in a very different way, however, because there are certain pieces that rotate other ones when moved that also have small little notches in them that allow power to be passed through them. These little slots can be pretty easy to miss as they are pretty small, and if you don't know about them and don't notice them, it can make these puzzles much more difficult to solve. Overall, I found this variety to be a bit less frustrating and more straightforward than the first, but it could still be very challenging at times. Personally, however, both of these puzzle types were an upgrade over their counterparts in the original DOS version. There was a kind of puzzle similar to the wire connection puzzle present in the original, and while it wasn't horrendous, I did find it to be frustrating at best. The other kind of puzzle is what the flow puzzle replaced, and while it has a similar idea, it was horrible. In order to get electricity to flow from one end to the other, you had to try to change these little X's to plus signs, but when you flipped one, it would change a bunch of the ones around it, in sometimes a not very obvious pattern. That felt like it took ages to work through. At least with these new puzzles, there's enough visual cues to help you figure out what's going on, And with the flow puzzle, when you rotate a piece that also rotates others, it's immediately obvious what pieces it's going to rotate. Despite the bit of frustration that these puzzles could provide, they do provide a nice moment of time to slow down and think, away from the fast-paced action that is common across the rest of the game. There's even a puzzle in one section of the game that involves beating the computer at chess, which if beaten will unlock a handy few extra inventory slots for you to use. However, if you want to skip as many of these as possible, aside from the giant chessboard which can't be skipped or bypassed, you will want to look out for logic probes. These little devices can be used at any of the junction boxes in order to instantly solve the puzzle, and in fact you may want to keep a few set aside just in case you find yourself needing to open a door to escape for your life. One feature that made System Shock unique and groundbreaking that has become much more prevalent today is the way in which it tells its story and feeds you information. Now popularized by games such as BioShock, Fallout, and even Halo 3 ODST, using collectible voice logs to tell a story was pioneered by the original System Shock. One of the things that the Looking Glass team was not satisfied with while making the Ultima Underworld games was the dialogue system. Austin Grossman, one of the initial designers for System Shock, posited that the dialogue trees, quote, broke the fiction of the immersive nature of the Ultima games, and that even in Ultima Underworld 2, he sought to cut down on them to keep the player immersed in the action. Here is what he said about how he solved this issue.
The inspiration for System Shock, part of it was actually a book called The Spoon River Anthology, which I don't know if you know it, but it's a book of poems, basically from the point of view of various different inhabitants of a small town, Spoon River, and that reading it, you get a kind of overarching sense of the life of that town and various things that
it's all
happen.
epitaphs, right?
Yes, I think Warren Spector knew it. So I think I originally had the Spoon River Anthology in my pitch for it, but that was the idea that for me concretized how System Shock could work, like a series of short speeches from people that, when put together, gave you the history of a place. It's much rehearsed now, but the advantages of that, of course, were less freezing of the game, less breaking of the fiction, less having you interact with people who couldn't really interact like people, and it was kind of palpable once you met someone in an RPG that they couldn't react to things. There was a lot in System Shock that was reacting against.
Although these logs were initially just readable text in the floppy version, the intent was always for them to be fully voiced. And the CD version of the game rectified this and helped to reinforce Grossman's desire to keep players immersed. The original logs were all recorded by Looking Glass employees and friends of Lo Piccolo, and thus sometimes come off as very amateur and poorly acted. However, in the remake, all the audio logs have been newly recorded and occasionally have the dialogue edited, in addition to a few new audio logs added to the game for increased immersion or tie-in with the sequel.
Shodan security is closing down on us. The elevators are frozen. Myra keeps saying that it's the cameras and the medical CPU core that Shodan's using these to hold onto the level. That's all fine, but I don't really see how it helps. The thing is everywhere.
Shodan has locked down the elevators. Mira says if we can lower the security on the level, we'll be able to gain access to restricted areas and get the lifts moving again. She says smashing cameras and taking the medical CPU nodes offline will help, but I don't see the point. This thing is everywhere.
The story is not only laid out in a somewhat non-linear fashion of reading past voice logs, but there are also a few examples where the logs are fed to you in real time in reaction to your actions. Shodan is not simply a passive AI you will work towards to face down at the end of the game, but an active hindrance attempting to thwart you at every turn. Because she is the artificial intelligence in charge of the station, anytime you do something to loosen her grip over the station, she will send you a threatening voicemail talking about how she will crush you or something like that. Oftentimes, these threats are not just hollow, as she will thoughtfully deploy a bunch of cyborg assassins or similar nasties upon you to pay you back for destroying her toys.
Destroy it, my children.
On the flip side, there are a few characters that send you messages to aid you on your journey. The main one is Rebecca Lansing, who sends you your first message of the game and will update you on what Shodan's current plans are to destroy humanity and possible leads on how to thwart them.
Hacker, Rebecca here. It says here that you're listed as employee 2-4601. Diego provided that cover to you, and the neural implant. In exchange for what? The keys to Shoda. Not hard to put two and two together regarding the current state of the station. Try op authorized to deal. Help get the station back under control, and you get a clean slate. Looks like we're partners now. And if we play this right, we can work out what Diego wants.
I prefer a quiet station. Thank you.
These provide a nice bit of guidance on what to do, and a feeling that there are characters out there trying to help you, even though Shodan desperately tries to make you feel isolated from anyone else. These logs, both picked up in the world and transmitted directly towards you, are vital to your progress. Very faithfully recreating the original game, there is not a quest marker or logs laid out for you to just walk to. You will need to piece things together based on what various characters tell you, and you may even need to revisit a log from time to time to recall a certain piece of information. This is a very different kind of game than most players will be used to, and you may even want to bust out a notepad in order to jot anything down that may be important. One example of this is the very first quest of the game, if you can call it that. Rebecca tells you that the mining laser is being charged for a strike against Earth. The laser cannot simply be shut down for whatever reason, so it will have to be destroyed. Early on, you will find an audio log referring to a set of steps that can be taken to destroy the laser. Enable the shields, disable the safety locks, and fire that laser into shields. Of course, it's not so simple, and further logs will tell you need to retrieve a certain isotope on the research level in order to disable the safety measures, and thus your quest begins with lots of further substeps. In other places, you may need to find a code to open a certain door, or in one case, detonate the whole station. There may be a log somewhere that says the code to X door is 123, but in other cases it may not be so direct. In a few spots, a character in a log will say something like, "The code for X door is being shown on the display in Y location, we should get that fixed." This may seem pretty obvious when laid out like this, but the System Shock subreddit seems to have a post every few weeks of someone asking where to find one of these codes. This is really a game that expects you to take hints and consider even throwaway pieces of dialogue important. And if you come into it with that mindset, you'll have a much more enjoyable time. Now, I cannot talk about this game without talking about the ending. If you want to avoid spoilers about some of the game's final plot points and the final boss fight, you can go ahead and skip ahead to the timestamp shown on the screen. As you near the end of the game and your final confrontation with Shodan, you will have taken many steps to thwart her. These steps include ejecting a whole grove into space to contain a virus, destroying the antennas on the station so she can't transmit herself to Earth, and even setting the station's reactor to self-destruct to destroy her permanently. Once you set the station to self-destruct, Lansing gives you instructions to get to the life pods and escape to safety, but of course Shodan won't make this easy on you, as she has very thoughtfully permanently deactivated the escape pods, so your only option is to try to flee to the bridge before she can separate it from the rest of the station.
No, you will not escape your actions. I will leave you here to die, enemy, along with the rotting corpses
of your pathetic species.
As you approach the bridge and the Shodan's mainframe, there are 3 encounters which I would describe as final bosses. The first is a final encounter with Edward Diego, who, having been turned into a cyborg to be Shodan's second in command, will head you off as you attempt to get her domain. You will likely have faced him twice before, depending on if you chose to attempt to escape in the life pods, and this encounter is his hardest of all. The battle challenges you to use all your resources, including thermal patches, hardware attachments, and likely every weapon in your arsenal. Even if you keep your distance from him, his rocket launchers can probably put a swift end to you. On the hardest difficulty, this may take a few attempts, but once you do take him down, he actually stays dead, whereas he would teleport away from previous encounters. While you search his corpse for a keycard to get up to the bridge, Showdown springs a surprise on you, which of course is a variety of tough enemies bearing down upon you. And this is totally inconvenient considering that you probably used up a ton of ammo and healing items to take Diego down. I chose to cowardly run to the elevator and escape, however, so Showdown should really plan her traps out better next time. Now that you've reached the bridge, Showdown threatens you with the usual nonsense about how you will die and you're doomed, but here it actually holds a bit more weight since A, the rest of the station is now destroyed, and B, there's no restoration bay on this level, meaning death is permanent at this stage on all difficulties. This can get a bit annoying, as up to this point I leaned on the restoration bays as a feature, but it just meant I ended up mashing F5 much more often. One thing to note about the bridge area as well is that it is thematically very different from the original game. In the original, the entirety of the bridge was covered in some sort of biological substance, suggesting that whatever abominations she had been breeding in Beta Grove made their way up to the bridge and infested it. Here, Nightdive opted instead for a cold metal machine environment, which I think works just as well. Most of the enemies you face at this point are massive lumbering cyborgs, including a few you haven't seen yet, so it all kind of works for me. Once you flip all the switches to get the computer room unlocked, you will face what I think is the real final boss fight. You have to flip a bunch of switches to get access to the Cyberjack, but of course while doing that, Showdown sends hordes of her toughest enemies after you. There is an electric charge station here and lots of first aid kits, but you will likely find yourself dying again and again. This is a pretty good fight, however, and it really pushes you to use all the skills and tools you've accumulated up to this point without feeling too unfair. There's always a little pillar you can hide behind or a room you can duck into to try to recover for a moment while you get your bearings. After clearing out the last bit of Showdown's minions, at long last you can face down Showdown in cyberspace, but with a small twist. However, I don't think this twist is really that good in my opinion. When the game first launched in the spring of 2023, one of the biggest criticisms was this ending fight. Just like in the original, you enter into cyberspace to deactivate Showdown, but for the remake they abandoned the Descent-like gameplay that the rest of the cyberspace sections have, and instead made it more like the first-person shooter gameplay of the rest of the game. However, it was both too tedious and too simple at the same time. You were given just a slow-firing single-shot rifle, and all you had to do was clear out all the enemies, hit a button, and move to the next area. You also respawned infinitely if you ran out of health, meaning there was suddenly no stakes or difficulty. Now, I don't think there was any difficulty in the original either, but that was one of the criticisms I had of that one, so I understand why they opted to change it. In response to this criticism, Nightdive put out a heavily modified ending as part of a patch about a year after release. In this rework, they kept the same style of gameplay, but added a bunch more types of weapons, more enemies, and a lives-limited cyberspace to make it an actual challenge. They also made it so you had to use these death rays Showdown sends at you to unlock the buttons, so there is a bit more thought involved. The problem for me, however, is that this ending actually ramped up the difficulty way too much. Especially on all threes, it's really hard to avoid fire from all the cyberspace enemies coming at you at once. And once you use your 3 lives, that's it, and you have to start the section over from the beginning. This includes a slightly tedious railroaded section that is just some Showdown dialogue. There are 0 health pickups or any way to replenish your health as far as I can tell. So it just felt like an unfair test of endurance, more frustrating than rewarding by far. The team did add in some more voice lines for Showdown, so it did feel a bit more like a proper fight instead of just unplugging a computer. But after the hour and a half or so that it took me to beat this segment, I was just done with it. Once you hit all these buttons, you can shoot the orbs now surrounding Cyber Showdown, and that's it. Showdown gets reset to factory settings, and the closing cutscene rolls. You are rescued from Citadel Station, returned to New Atlanta, and offered a job working for Trioptimum, which you reject, because I guess you would much rather keep on hacking as a freelancer. And the credits roll. And that's it for the System Shock Remake. The original System Shock has been one of my favorite games since I first played it about 10 years ago. And I am very happy to say that the remake has come in and sat alongside the original version as a game I will replay again and again. I didn't really notice any bugs besides the occasional weird ragdolls or minor physics quirk, and certainly nothing that impeded my experience or made it impossible to progress. This is honestly one of the best remakes I've ever had the pleasure of experiencing, taking everything that made the original game great and enhancing it just enough to be accessible to modern audiences. It did so without watering the unique elements it had down or changing the kind of game it was at its core. It is still a difficult, thoughtful, somewhat confusing game that requires you to listen, take notes, and plan carefully. But overall, it lets you blast cyborgs and mutant freaks alike, and I love it for that. I wholeheartedly recommend System Shock to anyone and everyone, and I know that I will continue to return to this version for many years to come. Thanks so much to everyone for watching this review and continuing to support my channel. I've been working on some upgrades to how I record videos, so I hope that those are reflected for you in this one. If you enjoyed this review, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with others. And stay tuned for lots more to come in the near future. I hope you enjoyed everything that I had to say about System Shock, and I hope that you have a great rest of your week.